The morning light breaks over Hickam Field, Hawaii. December 7th, 1941. Staff Sergeant William Hutchins is running. His hands are slick with gun oil as he yanks the charging handle on the Browning .50 caliber. The barrel is already hot. He's been firing for 6 minutes straight at the second wave of Japanese aircraft screaming overhead. The belt feeds smoothly through the receiver. 10 rounds, 20 rounds, 50 rounds. Then it happens. The gun stops. The belt has twisted. A single malformed link has caused the entire ammunition feed to bind. He clears it. Fires again. Another jam. Around him, other gun positions fall silent one by one, their crews frantically trying to clear fouled ammunition belts while enemy aircraft strafe the field unopposed. In those first chaotic hours of America's entry into the war, the .50 caliber Browning machine gun proved both invaluable and maddeningly unreliable. The gun itself was magnificent. John Browning's design was nearly perfect. But the ammunition delivery system, the belts that fed those half-inch cartridges into the gun's hungry chamber, was failing at the worst possible moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem wasn't new. It had been there since the gun's adoption, lurking in every training exercise, every test firing, every qualification course. The early metallic link belts, while superior to the canvas belts of the First World War, still jammed. They twisted, they bound. And when you needed sustained fire, when you needed to pour 1,000 rounds into an enemy bomber formation or sweep a beach with covering fire, the belt feed system was your weakest link. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun was, by 1942, the standard heavy machine gun for every branch of the United States military. On aircraft, it was designated the AN M2, a lightened version with a 36-inch barrel instead of the 45-inch ground gun barrel. The aircraft version could fire up to 800 rounds per minute. The heavier barrel ground version fired between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. These weren't just impressive numbers, they were necessary. The .50 caliber round itself, the 12.7mm BMG cartridge, was a marvel of engineering. It could penetrate an inch of armor plate at 200 meters. It could destroy an aircraft engine. It could cut through a tree trunk. But all that firepower meant nothing if the gun jammed after 50 rounds. The early war period exposed the problem brutally. Bomber crews discovered that their defensive positions, each mounting a pair of .50 caliber guns, would jam during critical moments of combat. The standard ammunition can held 105 rounds on metallic links. In theory, you could connect multiple belts for continuous fire. In practice, the connections often failed. The belts twisted, the links bent. A single damaged link in a string of hundreds could stop the entire gun. Fighter pilots faced different but equally deadly constraints. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 .50 caliber Brownings and 3,200 rounds of ammunition, 400 rounds per gun. But those 400 rounds were spread across multiple belts that had to feed reliably at high altitude, in freezing temperatures, while the aircraft pulled multiple G-forces in combat maneuvering. Jams were common enough that pilots learned to test fire their guns before engaging, wasting precious ammunition just to ensure the feed system was working. The problem was materials and design. The metallic link belt, standardized as the M2 link, was made of stamped steel. Each link held a single cartridge and articulated with the link ahead of it. When the gun fired, the bolt stripped the cartridge forward out of the link, and the empty link was ejected. It was an elegant system, but it required precision manufacturing. Each link had to be identical, the spacing had to be exact, the steel had to be the right hardness, flexible enough to articulate but rigid enough to maintain alignment. By late 1942, the United States was ramping up for total war production. Millions of .50 caliber rounds were being manufactured every month, but the metallic links couldn't keep pace. The Metallic Belt Link Industry Integration Committee, a group with a bureaucratic name but a critical mission, realized in December of 1942 that they would not meet 1943 production goals. Steel shortages, machine tool delays. The math was simple and terrifying. You needed one link for every cartridge. If you were producing 1,000,000 rounds a day, you needed 1,000,000 links a day. And if those links were jamming guns in combat, you needed them to be perfect. The Bureau of Ordnance initiated a study. Could fabric, belts, the old canvas technology from the Great War, be brought back? Not for aircraft use, where only metallic links would work, but for ground forces, for anti-aircraft positions, for the dozens of applications where weight wasn't critical, but reliability was essential. The challenge went to American industry. Multiple manufacturers began working on designs. The requirements were specific. The belt had to hold the .50 caliber cartridges securely. It had to feed reliably through the M2's pull-out, push-through feed mechanism. It had to be manufactured quickly, without the precision tooling required for metallic links. And critically, it had to allow for the connection of multiple belts to create longer ammunition feeds. This last requirement was the key. A 100-round belt was useful, but anti-aircraft crews needed more. During the Battle of Britain, German bomber formations had learned to concentrate fire on British anti-aircraft positions during the time it took crews to reload. 10 seconds of silence could be fatal. American planners knew that any future defense would require continuous fire. Bombers were getting faster. Attacks were getting more coordinated. You couldn't afford to stop shooting. The Russell Manufacturing Company of Connecticut held the answer, though they didn't know it yet. They were a textile manufacturer, making everything from industrial belting to canvas products. When the call came from Ordnance, they put their engineers on the problem. The solution they developed was deceptively simple: a fabric belt with pockets for each cartridge, numbered every 25 rounds for easy counting. But the innovation was in the ends. Each belt was fitted with fabric connecting loops, a design they would later patent as number 2,422,898. These connecting loops allowed two fabric belts to be joined together securely, not with metal clips, not with complex mechanisms, just fabric, loops that interlocked and held under tension. An assistant gunner could connect a fresh belt to the end of a belt already feeding into the gun. Continuous fire without opening the feed tray, without stopping the gun, without that deadly 10-second silence. On January 8, 1943, the 100-round fabric belt was adopted as standard under the designation M7. It was, on paper, a step backward. Fabric instead of steel, an old technology instead of a new one. But it worked. The M7 belt was completely made of fabric. It was lighter than metallic links. It was quieter. It didn't clink and rattle during movement, and most importantly, it didn't jam. The initial production run was 100 rounds per belt, but field testing immediately showed potential for more. The M2 ammunition can, designed to hold 105 rounds on metallic links, could accommodate a fabric belt with up to 110 rounds without difficulty. By March of 1943, the capacity was increased to 110 rounds while keeping the M7 designation unchanged. Most M7 belts were manufactured from green fabric, though small quantities were made from white fabric for different environmental conditions. The belt pockets were numbered in black ink every 25 rounds, with numbers ranging from 25 to 100, while the first pocket was numbered 1 and the last 110. The belts also bore in black ink the designation of the manufacturer, the month and year of production, and the reference to United States Ordnance standards. But the real test wasn't in a factory or a testing range. It was in combat. And combat was coming faster than anyone expected. By September of 1943, metallic link production had finally caught up with demand. All factories reached nominal production rate. The crisis had passed. In theory, the fabric belts were no longer necessary. But something unexpected happened. Units that had received the M7 belts didn't want to give them up. Reports came back from North Africa, from the Pacific, from training bases in the continental United States. The fabric belts were popular. Crews trusted them. The ability to link belts together during firing had proven itself in combat. Anti-aircraft positions that had struggled with jam-prone metallic links found they could maintain fire for minutes at a time with the M7 system. The connecting loops were the key innovation. What Russell Manufacturing had created wasn't just a belt. It was a system that allowed for virtually unlimited continuous fire, limited only by barrel heat and ammunition supply. An assistant gunner with a stack of M7 belts could keep a gun firing for as long as the barrel could take it. 220 rounds, 440 rounds, 660 rounds. Each connection, taking only seconds, performed while the gun was still firing. This was the capability that field armourers and crew chiefs had been requesting since the gun's adoption. This was what could turn a .50 caliber position from a weapon that fired in short bursts to one that could lay down sustained suppressive fire that enemy forces simply couldn't cross. The official narrative said that fabric belts were for training and reserve use only. The official narrative said that metallic links were superior for combat. But the soldiers and marines and sailors using the guns in actual combat told a different story. They told a story of reliability, of belts that fed smoothly in dust and sand and salt spray, of connections that held through hours of continuous fire, of guns that kept firing when they were needed most. By late 1943, M7 fabric belts were being used in combat in Europe. Period photographs show them clearly. Recovery teams still find them today in combat areas of northeastern France, near the Belgian border where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, and near the German border in Alsace. These aren't training belts accidentally left behind. These are combat-used ammunition belts, fired in anger, emptied in defense of positions under attack. The story of the M7 belt is not a story of one machinist's brilliant innovation in a single moment of inspiration. It's a more complex story, a more realistic story. It's a story of industrial mobilization, of engineers at textile companies solving military problems, of patent applications that represented months of testing and refinement. It's a story of field soldiers who knew what worked and demanded to keep using it, even when official policy said otherwise. But there's a human element to this story that often gets lost in the technical specifications and production numbers. Behind every innovation, behind every solution to a wartime problem, there were people. Engineers who worked 70-hour weeks to meet production deadlines. Factory workers who assembled belts by the thousands. And most importantly, the armourers and technicians who took these fabric belts and made them work in conditions their designers never imagined. Staff Sergeant William Hutchins, the man fumbling with jammed belts at Hickam Field on December 7, 1941, survived Pearl Harbor. He spent the next year at Hickam, helping rebuild the defences, training new crews on the .50 caliber positions that ringed the airfield. When the M7 fabric belts arrived in mid-1943, he was sceptical. Fabric seemed like a step backward. The metallic links looked more modern, more military. But the first time he connected two M7 belts during a practice firing, the first time he felt how smoothly they fed, how reliably the gun cycled round after round without a single jam, he became a convert. He started requesting M7 belts specifically for his position. He showed other armourers how to inspect the belts, how to load them properly, how to make the connections smoothly even under stress. By late 1944, Hutchins was training crews heading to the Pacific. He taught them about the .50 caliber, about proper maintenance, about sight alignment and trigger control. But he spent just as much time teaching them about ammunition handling, about keeping the belts clean and dry, about making those critical belt connections when a Japanese aircraft was diving toward your position and you had maybe 30 seconds before it opened fire. He told them that the gun was reliable. Browning's design was nearly perfect, but the ammunition feed system was their responsibility. Load it right. Maintain it properly. Trust the fabric belts even though they looked less impressive than metallic links, because in combat, reliability mattered more than appearance. Function mattered more than form. The lessons he taught weren't in any technical manual. They were the accumulated wisdom of 3 years of war, of countless hours at the gun, of watching what worked and what failed when lives depended on the outcome. The official designation might be M7 fabric belt. The official purpose might be to supplement metallic link production during shortages. But the real purpose, the purpose that mattered to the men using these belts in combat, was simple: keep the gun firing, keep it firing when the enemy attacked, keep it firing until the threat was gone. This was the standard that Russell Manufacturing's connecting loops enabled. This was the capability that transformed the .50 caliber from a powerful but temperamental weapon into a truly reliable defensive tool. 110 rounds per belt, 2 belts connected for 220 rounds, 3 belts for 330 rounds. The math was simple, but the implications were profound. A gun that could fire continuously for the length of an entire attack. A gun that enemy forces couldn't suppress by simply waiting for the reload pause. A gun that kept firing. The Pacific Theater revealed the M7's true value in ways no testing range ever could. The environment was hostile to machinery. Salt spray corroded metal, humidity warped wood, sand infiltrated every mechanism, and the metallic link belts, precision manufactured in climate-controlled factories, suffered badly. Marine Corporal James Delaney learned this on Tarawa in November of 1943. His gun position was dug into the seawall, one of dozens of .50 caliber emplacements protecting the beachhead. The Japanese counterattacked at night. Wave after wave of infantry charged across the beach in the darkness, and Delaney's gun was one of the few heavy weapons that could stop them. He fired in long bursts, sweeping the beach with tracers that ignited the night. The metallic link belt fed for perhaps 70 rounds before a link bent and the gun jammed. His assistant, a private from Nebraska whose name Delaney never learned, cleared the jam in the darkness by feel alone. They resumed firing. Another 40 rounds. Another jam. The salt air had corroded the links just enough to make them unreliable. Each jam cost them seconds they didn't have. Each stoppage allowed the enemy to advance closer to their position. When fresh ammunition arrived the next morning, it included M7 fabric belts. Delaney was skeptical. They looked less sturdy than the metallic links. But the supply sergeant insisted, and Delaney was too exhausted to argue. That night, when the next counterattack came, he loaded the fabric belt and began firing. The belt fed smoothly, no jams, no stoppages. He burned through 110 rounds, and his assistant connected a second belt without Delaney even lifting his thumbs from the trigger. 220 rounds of continuous fire. The attack broke apart under that sustained volume of fire, bodies piling up in the surf as the tracers found their marks again and again. After that night, Delaney requested fabric belts exclusively. He didn't care that they looked less modern. He didn't care that some rear echelon officers preferred the appearance of metallic links. He cared that they worked when it mattered. That was the only standard that counted. Similar stories emerged from the European theatre. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 put enormous strain on American defensive positions. German attacks came at dawn, at dusk, in the middle of the night. Anti-aircraft crews found themselves pressed into ground defense roles. Their .50 caliber guns turned horizontal to sweep roads and tree lines instead of tracking aircraft overhead. Technical Sergeant Robert Kessler commanded one such position near Bastogne. His crew had 4 .50 caliber guns arranged in a semicircle, interlocking fields of fire that covered the main approach to their sector. They had metallic link ammunition, the standard issue, but they also had a dozen M7 fabric belts that had been scrounged from a supply dump before the German offensive cut them off. On December 20th, 1944, a German armoured column tried to force the road. Kessler's guns opened fire at 800 metres. The lead tank's tracks threw sparks as .50 caliber armour-piercing rounds hammered against them. The infantry following the tanks scattered, seeking cover in the ditches alongside the road. This was the moment Kessler needed sustained fire. This was the moment the guns couldn't jam. He had ordered the fabric belts loaded specifically for this scenario. Each gun had 3 M7 belts ready, 330 rounds of continuous fire available without reloading. The guns fired in sequence, one taking over as another adjusted aim or let the barrel cool slightly. The noise was overwhelming, a hammering roar that echoed off the frozen ground. Spent brass cascaded from the guns like golden rain, and the belts fed flawlessly. The German attack stalled. The infantry couldn't advance through that wall of fire. The tanks, without infantry support, were vulnerable to the American bazooka teams that crept through the snow to attack from the flanks. By nightfall, the road was impassable, littered with disabled vehicles and abandoned equipment. Kessler's position had held, and the fabric belts had given them the sustained fire capability that made the difference. But not every position had access to the M7 belts. Official distribution prioritized metallic links for frontline units. The fabric belts were supposed to be secondary, backup ammunition for training units and rear area defenses. This created a strange situation where frontline soldiers actively sought out what was officially considered inferior ammunition because they knew from experience it was more reliable. Supply sergeants learned to barter for fabric belts. Armourers hoarded them. Experienced crews requested them by name, asking specifically for the M7 designation even when metallic link ammunition was more readily available. This created its own problems. Ammunition requisition forms had categories for metallic link 50 caliber. They didn't always have categories for fabric belt 50 caliber. Creative accounting was required to maintain adequate stocks. The Army Air Forces faced different challenges. For aircraft use, fabric belts were impossible. The feed mechanism required metallic links that could handle the G-forces of combat maneuvering, the vibration of the aircraft, the extreme cold at altitude. But even here, the lessons learned from the M7's connecting loop system influenced design thinking. Engineers examined why the Russell manufacturing loops worked so well. The answer was elegant. The loops didn't rely on rigid precision. They relied on flexible strength. Under tension, the fabric loops tightened and held. Under the rapid cycling of the gun's feed mechanism, they maintained alignment through flexibility rather than rigidity. This was counterintuitive to engineers trained to think in terms of precision machining and tight tolerances, but it worked. And that practical success led to improvements in metallic link design as well. The M2 link was refined to allow better articulation. The connection points were redesigned to be more forgiving of slight manufacturing variations. The steel alloy was adjusted to provide better flexibility without sacrificing strength. These improvements didn't happen overnight. They accumulated across 1943 and 1944 as combat experience fed back to the design engineers. By 1945, American 50 caliber ammunition belts, whether fabric or metallic link, were the most reliable in the world. Jam rates had dropped dramatically. Sustained fire capability had increased, and critically, the connecting systems allowed for extended fire missions that would have been impossible in 1941. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The numbers tell part of the story. A standard M2 ammunition can hold 105 rounds on metallic links or 110 rounds on fabric belt. But with the connecting loop system, an assistant gunner could have multiple belts ready. In anti-aircraft positions around critical facilities, standard practice became to have 5 M7 belts prepared and connected in sequence, 550 rounds ready to fire without pause. This capability changed tactical planning. Before the M7, anti-aircraft doctrine assumed guns would fire in short bursts, pausing to reload every 100 rounds. Defensive plans had to account for these reload pauses. Multiple gun positions had to coordinate to ensure continuous coverage. It was complex and relied on split-second timing that often failed under combat stress. With the M7 system, a single gun position could maintain fire through an entire attack run. The implications for defense were significant. Fewer guns could protect the same area. Ammunition could be concentrated at critical positions. And perhaps most importantly, the psychological impact on attacking forces was severe. There's a profound difference between facing a gun that fires in bursts and facing a gun that never stops firing. Luftwaffe pilots attacking American positions in Europe learned this the hard way. Early in the war, their tactics had relied on suppressing defensive fire during approach, timing attacks for the moment when guns were reloading. By late 1944, those tactics were failing. The 50 caliber positions kept firing through the entire attack run, from first detection to final impact or escape. The sustained fire created a curtain of steel that forced aircraft higher, reduced accuracy, and inflicted casualties that made each mission more costly. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots faced similar challenges. The kamikaze attacks of 1945 relied on overwhelming defensive fire through sheer numbers, but the improved American ammunition feed systems meant that each gun could engage more targets. A position that might have stopped 2 aircraft in 1942 could stop 4 or 5 by 1945, simply because the guns kept firing reliably. The logistics of this improvement were staggering. Russell Manufacturing Company wasn't the only producer of M7 belts. Multiple textile manufacturers across the United States ramped up production through 1943 and 1944. The belts were simpler to manufacture than metallic links. No precision stamping required, no hardening processes, no complex dye work. This meant faster production with less skilled labor, critical advantages when experienced machinists were in short supply. Each M7 belt was packaged simply, no heavy wooden crates like metallic link ammunition required. The fabric belts could be folded carefully and packed in lighter containers. This reduced shipping weight, which meant more ammunition could be transported per cargo vessel or aircraft. In the Pacific, especially, where every supply run was precious, this weight savings translated directly to more ammunition available at the front. But the real innovation wasn't just the fabric belt itself. It was the connecting loop system that made the belts part of a larger feeding apparatus. This was the insight that Russell Manufacturing's engineers had achieved and patented. They hadn't just created a belt. They'd created a modular system where individual components could be connected reliably under field conditions without tools or complex procedures. An assistant gunner could connect belts by feel in the dark. A crew could prepare connected belts in advance, creating ammunition feeds of whatever length the tactical situation required. A 50 caliber position defending a critical bridge might have 1,500 rounds connected and ready, ensuring they could maintain fire through any attack that bridge defenses might face. This flexibility was unprecedented. The patent itself, number 2,422,898, was filed during the war and granted after. It described in technical language what soldiers already knew from experience. The connecting loops created a reliable, tool-free connection that maintained alignment under the dynamic loads of rapid fire. The fabric construction allowed for some give, some flexibility that actually improved reliability rather than compromising it. This ran counter to the prevailing engineering philosophy. Military equipment was supposed to be rigid, precise, built to exact tolerances. The idea that flexibility could improve performance was radical, but the combat results were undeniable. The M7 system worked better in field conditions than the theoretically superior metallic link system. There's a broader lesson here about innovation during wartime. The most effective solutions often come from unexpected directions. Russell Manufacturing wasn't a weapons company. They made industrial textiles. When asked to solve a military problem, they brought textile engineering expertise to a challenge that had been approached primarily from a metallic manufacturing perspective. Their solution worked precisely because it came from a different technical tradition. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Civilian industries brought expertise to military problems that military arsenals alone couldn't solve. The industrial mobilization of the United States wasn't just about converting auto factories to tank production. It was about bringing diverse technical knowledge to bear on complex problems. Sometimes, a textile manufacturer's approach to ammunition feeding was exactly what the situation required. By the spring of 1945, M7 fabric belts were standard issue for ground-based 50 caliber positions across all theaters. The official designation might still list them as supplementary to metallic links, but field reality told a different story. Soldiers trusted the fabric belts. They requested them, they hoarded them when supplies were limited. And when the war ended, When the massive post-war surplus of equipment was catalogued and stored, M7 fabric belts were found in every corner of the American military's global deployment. The guns that had fired these belts had their own stories. Some 50 caliber Brownings fired hundreds of thousands of rounds during the war. Barrels were changed, receivers were rebuilt. But the basic design proved so robust that many guns in service in 1945 had been manufactured in the late 1930s. These weren't new weapons. They were veterans, their receivers marked with the scars of continuous use, their mechanisms worn smooth by countless cycles. And through all those rounds, through all that firing, the feed system had evolved from a weakness to a strength. The early jams at Pearl Harbor were largely eliminated by 1945. The careful attention to belt design, the improvements in link, manufacturing, the adoption of fabric belts where they performed better than metallic links, all of this combined to create a weapon system that was truly reliable when it mattered most. The end of the war didn't end the story of the M7 fabric belt. In August of 1945, when Japan surrendered, American forces occupied positions across the Pacific. Every position seemed to have mountains of supplies accumulated during the build-up for what everyone expected would be the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Among those supplies were millions of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, much of it still on M7 fabric belts. The occupation forces kept those belts. They remained in service through the immediate post-war period, through the demobilization, through the transition from wartime to peacetime military structure. When the Korean War erupted in June of 1950, American forces deployed with equipment that was largely World War II vintage, and that included M7 fabric belts alongside metallic link ammunition. Korea proved the M7's durability in yet another environment. The bitter cold of Korean winters affected ammunition feed systems. Metallic links became brittle. Lubrication thickened. But the fabric belts, stored properly and kept dry, continued to feed reliably. Marine and Army positions defending the Pusan perimeter in 1950, holding Chipyong-ni in 1951, relied on 50 caliber guns that fed from M7 belts manufactured 7 or 8 years earlier. Staff Sergeant William Hutchins, the armourer from Pearl Harbor, had retired from service in 1947. He returned to civilian life in Oregon, working in a logging camp and trying to forget the sound of aircraft engines that still woke him some nights. When Korea started, he was too old for recall, but he followed the news closely. He read reports of the fighting, of American positions under attack, of 50 caliber guns providing critical defensive fire. He wondered if the crews in Korea knew about the fabric belts, if they'd discovered the same reliability he'd learned to trust. If somewhere on a frozen hillside, an assistant gunner was connecting M7 belts in the darkness while enemy forces advanced, keeping the gun firing through techniques Hutchins had taught to hundreds of students back in Hawaii. He never learned the answer to those questions, but the belts were there. Recovery operations in Korea decades later found M7 fabric belts at defensive positions, still recognizable despite years of exposure, still bearing the manufacturer stamps and dates from 1943 and 1944. These weren't training ammunition. These were combat loads, fired in anger, emptied in defense of positions under attack, just as they had been at Tarawa and Bastogne and 100 other battlefields. Marine Corporal James Delaney survived the war. He'd fought across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Saipan to Okinawa. He'd fired tens of thousands of rounds through 50 caliber guns, watched as the ammunition feed systems improved from the jam-prone early war metallic links to the reliable M7 fabric belts. When he returned home to Philadelphia in 1946, he carried with him a deep appreciation for the unglamorous innovations that kept weapons functioning when lives depended on them. He never talked much about the war. When pressed by family or friends, he would describe the islands, the heat, the fear. But occasionally he would mention the gun, the 50 caliber that never let him down, the ammunition belts that kept feeding no matter what. It wasn't a story of heroism. It was a story of reliability, of engineering that worked when it had to, of innovations that soldiers trusted because experience had proven them trustworthy. Technical Sergeant Robert Kessler stayed in the army after the war. He'd commanded defensive positions at Bastogne, watched as the M7 fabric belts provided the sustained fire capability that helped hold the line against German attacks. After the war, he was assigned to training duties, teaching new generations of soldiers about crew-served weapons, about the .50 caliber, about proper ammunition handling. He emphasized the lessons of combat. That reliability mattered more than appearance, that simple solutions often worked better than complex ones, that the men who designed the M7 fabric belt system, sitting in offices and factories far from any battlefield, had nonetheless created something that saved lives by the simple act of working consistently. Kessler retired in 1963 after 23 years of service. By then, the M2 Browning .50 caliber was itself becoming a legend, approaching 50 years of service with no replacement in sight. The gun was fundamentally the same as Browning's original design. But the ammunition feed systems had evolved dramatically. The M7 fabric belt had largely been replaced by improved metallic links that incorporated lessons learned during the war. But the connecting loop principle, the idea that ammunition feeds should be modular and extendable without tools, that principle remained standard. The Russell Manufacturing Company's patent, granted in the late 1940s, became part of the technical literature that ammunition designers studied. The connecting loop system influenced ammunition belt design across calibers and weapon systems. The core insight that reliable connections mattered as much as the ammunition itself became doctrine. But the M7 belts themselves faded from service gradually through the 1950s. Improved metallic links, benefiting from better manufacturing techniques and materials, matched the fabric belt's reliability while offering advantages in durability and weather resistance. By the Vietnam War, fabric belts were largely relegated to training use and reserve stocks. The metallic link belt had finally achieved the reliability that fabric belts had provided 2 decades earlier, yet the legacy remained. Every modern ammunition feed system for crew-served weapons traces lineage back to innovations made during World War II. The principle of modular, connectable ammunition feeds is now so standard that it seems obvious. But in 1942, when the Metallic Belt Link Industry Integration Committee faced production shortfalls and combat reports detailed jam after jam, it wasn't obvious at all. The solution required thinking differently. It required engineers at a textile company to approach a metallic ammunition feed problem from a fabric perspective. It required field soldiers to trust what looked like inferior technology because combat experience taught them it worked better. It required logistics officers to distribute ammunition that wasn't in the official priority system because frontline commanders requested it specifically. This is a story about innovation, but not the kind of innovation that gets monuments or medals. It's about incremental improvements, about solving practical problems with practical solutions, about the unglamorous work of making existing systems more reliable. The M7 fabric belt didn't win the war. No single technology or weapon did. But it contributed to victory in the way most military innovations contribute, by reducing the friction of combat, by giving soldiers tools they could trust, by turning theoretical firepower into practical, reliable defensive capability. The central irony of the story is that what was officially considered a stopgap measure, a temporary solution to production shortfalls, became in practice more trusted and more effective than the supposedly superior technology it was meant to supplement. The fabric belts weren't supposed to be better than metallic links, but in field conditions, in combat, they often were, and soldiers, who stake their lives on equipment reliability, chose the fabric belts whenever they could. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Official doctrine says one thing, field reality proves another. The gap between the two is where soldiers live and where they learn what actually works. The .50 caliber Browning was always a magnificent weapon. John Browning's design was brilliant, but brilliance in design means nothing if the ammunition won't feed reliably. The M7 fabric belt solved that fundamental problem at a critical moment in history. By the time Staff Sergeant William Hutchins died in 1978, The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun had been in continuous service for over 50 years. It would continue serving for decades more. The gun he'd frantically tried to unjam during the Pearl Harbor attack, the gun that had failed him when he needed it most because metallic link belts twisted and jammed, that gun had become one of the most reliable weapons ever fielded. Not because the gun itself changed dramatically, but because every component of the system around it improved incrementally over years of combat experience. The ammunition belts, the links, the connecting systems, the loading procedures, the maintenance protocols, all of it evolved based on what worked in combat rather than what looked good on paper. And at the center of that evolution, for a critical period during the height of World War II, was a fabric belt with connecting loops, manufactured by a textile company, trusted by soldiers who needed weapons that didn't fail when their lives depended on it. James Delaney died in 2003, one of the last survivors of the Tarawa landing. He was 83 years old. Near the end, his daughter asked him what he remembered most clearly from the war. She expected him to talk about the fear, the chaos, the friends he'd lost. Instead, he talked about a night on a beach when the gun kept firing, when the ammunition belt fed smoothly through round after round without jamming, when he and his assistant held their position because the weapon didn't fail them. It wasn't a dramatic story. It wasn't the kind of memory that makes for stirring combat narratives, but it was the truth of his experience. That reliability, that trust in equipment that worked when it had to, that was what he remembered. The 50 caliber gun that kept firing, the fabric ammunition belt that fed without jamming, the innovation that saved his life by the simple act of functioning correctly. Robert Kessler died in 2009. He was 91 years old. In his effects, his family found a small piece of fabric with black ink markings. It took them time to identify it, but eventually they realized it was a fragment of an M7 ammunition belt, the numbering still visible despite decades of storage. He'd kept it since the war. A memento of the Battle of the Bulge, of nights spent firing at German attacks, of ammunition belts that never failed. His grandson asked why he'd kept such a small, unremarkable piece of cloth. What did it mean to him? Kessler had never explained it while alive, but the answer was clear to anyone who understood the context. That fragment represented reliability. It represented innovation that worked. It represented the gap between what official reports said was important and what soldiers in combat actually needed. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun remains in service today, over 100 years after John Browning completed the initial design. It has served in more conflicts, in more countries, in more roles than any other machine gun in history. Modern variants feature quick-change barrels, improved mounting systems, updated ammunition types, but the basic mechanism, the fundamental design, remains Browning's work. And the ammunition feed systems, the belts and links that deliver rounds to that mechanism, trace their reliability directly to innovations made during World War II. The M7 fabric belt is long obsolete, but the principles it embodied, modular design, tool-free, connection, reliability under field conditions, those principles are standard in every modern crew-served weapon. The story of the 50 caliber's evolution from jam-prone early war weapon to ultra-reliable modern system is a story told in small increments, each improvement slight, each innovation modest, but accumulated over years, over millions of rounds fired, over countless combat engagements. Those small improvements transformed the weapon system completely. This is how most military innovation actually works. Not through dramatic breakthroughs and revolutionary designs, but through incremental refinement guided by combat experience. The engineers at Russell Manufacturing Company who designed the M7's connecting loops weren't trying to revolutionize warfare. They were trying to solve a practical problem. Make ammunition belts that connected reliably. Make connections that soldiers could perform in the dark, under stress, while under fire. They succeeded, and in succeeding, they contributed to the broader success of American military operations during World War II. Every 50 caliber position that maintained fire through an attack because the ammunition belt didn't jam. Every defensive position that held because the guns kept firing. Every aircraft that crashed because defensive fire was too intense to penetrate. The M7 fabric belt was part of that success, invisible in the broader narrative but critical in the moment. The morning of December 7th, 1941, Hickam Field, Hawaii. Staff Sergeant William Hutchins struggles with a jammed .50 caliber gun while Japanese aircraft strafe the field unopposed. The gun itself is magnificent, but the ammunition feed system fails at the critical moment. The belt twists, the link binds, and in that moment of malfunction, the gap between theoretical firepower and practical capability becomes deadly clear. By December 7th, 1944, exactly 3 years later, that gap had largely closed. American .50 caliber positions around the world maintained fire through entire attacks. The fabric belts fed reliably. The connecting loops allowed sustained fire that enemy forces couldn't overcome. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It happened gradually, improvement by improvement, combat report by combat report, until the weapon system that had failed at Pearl Harbor had become the most reliable heavy machine gun in the world. That transformation is the real story of the M7 fabric belt, not a single machinist's brilliant innovation, not a dramatic breakthrough that changed warfare overnight, but rather the accumulation of practical solutions to practical problems, guided by soldiers who knew what worked because their lives depended on that knowledge. The .50 caliber Browning earned its legendary status through combat effectiveness sustained over decades of service. But that effectiveness relied on every component of the weapon system working reliably. The ammunition feed system, often overlooked in discussions of the gun's capabilities, was critical to that reliability. And for a crucial period during World War II, the M7 fabric belt with its Russell manufacturing connecting loops provided that reliability when it was needed most. This is the story of an innovation that saved lives not through revolutionary change, but through incremental improvement, through making existing systems work better, through listening to soldiers who understood field conditions better than any engineer in a distant factory could, through valuing reliability over appearance, function over form, practical effectiveness over theoretical superiority. The men who fought with these weapons, who trusted the M7 fabric belts because experience taught them those belts didn't fail, those men understood something profound about military technology, that the best weapon isn't the most advanced or the most powerful. The best weapon is the one that works when you need it, every time, without fail. That's what the M7 fabric belt provided. That's why soldiers trusted it. And that's why its legacy, though largely forgotten in the broader narrative of World War II, represents something fundamentally important about how wars are actually won. Not through miracle weapons or dramatic breakthroughs, but through reliable equipment, trusted by the soldiers who use it, functioning correctly when lives depend on it. That's the lesson of the M7 fabric belt. That's the story that needed to be told. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.